For my study, I'm looking at in what literacy engagement practices do young adults engage within fanfiction communities centered on young adult literature. So I'm basically going to be looking at what kind of literacy practices they are doing in the online fanfiction communities. So I'm going to start with a semi-structured focus group interview. I'm going to get a bunch of them together and ask them about what they do in these spaces and why they do it. Then I'm going to ask them to keep an activity log. They'll probably be doing this for at least a week, depending on when I schedule the follow-up interview. So I want them to keep track of what they do in these spaces, how much time they spend on these spaces with that log. Then in the follow-up semi-structured individual interview, I'm going to ask them about things in their activity log, any follow-up questions that I have based on the group interview. And then what I would really love to do is do a think aloud protocol at this follow-up interview. So after that part's over, or maybe before that part, so I can ask more questions, I'd like to have them access their online spaces with me there. I read about this being done with an instant messaging study. So they would get on there and do what they would normally do, and then of course think aloud, explain to me what they're doing, what they're thinking as they're going through these spaces and interacting, either reading or writing or reviewing or commenting, any of that kind of thing. So I'm kind of going to go out in concentric circles about like expanding on the theoretical framework. So kind of the closest thing in is participatory culture. And I'm getting most of this from Henry Jenkins. And I'm using several quotes in this because I like the way they're phrasing things, but rejecting media-fostered stereotypes of fans as cultural dupes, social misfits, and mindless consumers, this book perceives fans as active producers and manipulators of meaning. So really the main thing I'm getting at with participatory culture is the ways that fans interact with text or media that's a little different than everyone else. This particular culture does something a little different. So some of the things, they analyze really closely, read and reread, reimagine, reproduce. Often they subvert the original text, and really all of this coalesces into them really becoming owners of the text and possessing it. So in participatory culture, it's a little bit different than just a simple reading of a text. It's a really thorough and engaged and active way of reading, a very different way of reading. So that kind of broadens out a little bit into new literacies. So while participatory culture was around before the internet or before a lot of these new technologies that we associate with new literacies really have brought it out a little bit. New spaces have been created for participatory culture, and while new literacies is broader than participatory culture, I think it encompasses it. So another long quote, but this really captures that connection between new literacies and participatory culture. Participants in new literacy practices actively seek out memberships and peers in areas of affinity and interest and pursue different kinds of relationships between authors and audiences from those characterizing many conventional literacy practices. They generally value attending to the interests and knowledge of others, recognize that quality is judged by groups rather than appointed experts, welcome diversity of opinion and decision-making, and so on. The broad ethos of new literacies sets them apart from simply being conventional literacies in digital form. And Noble and Linkshire are people I'm using the most for new literacies. And what I really think this quote gets at is that a big piece of new literacies is social navigation and negotiation of text. There is more to new literacies, but that is one big difference that we can. In traditional literacies, we have social interaction around it, but not just social action around a text, but social creation of a text and social reading of a text, where it's really others' opinions are feeding into and fueling your opinion. So that gets into my other one. One important element of new literacies is the social interaction in text, reading, and creation. So that social element of new literacies also brings me into sociocultural and situated literacy or situated language. So a quick drive-by citing Vygotsky and Lave. So social learning and cognitive apprenticeship. So of course they've had this idea of cognitive apprenticeship where we have a real world space with kind of experts within it, and students or the learner learns through interacting with those experts and performing real tasks. And so that's what happens in these online fanfiction communities. And then of course Vygotsky, just the idea of learning in groups, which is obviously what's happening here as well. So to be a little more specific, I'm going to be using a lot of G. So reading instruction must move well beyond relations internal to texts. Reading instruction must be rooted in the connections of text to engagement and in simulations of actions, activities, and interactions to real and imagined material and social worlds. So this is about grounding text interactions in the social and in the real world, which is what's happening in these communities. Specifically, that ties back into those communities and kind of gets into the next one, because those communities are affinity spaces, also G. So these are affinity spaces. These social communities of learning are affinity spaces. They're participatory cultures where social communities are brought together by motivation and engagement, which would be the third piece here, motivation and engagement. So we all know that that increases reading comprehension. And so the thing about it is that these participatory communities, basically for many reasons, they are motivating in and of themselves. So some motivation causes people to participate, kind of going this way of the triangle, and then motivation or participation in the activity also shows engagement, so kind of going the other way. So to show that, things that are motivating about these communities, choice, obviously, all these things are things that Guthrie has noted to increase motivation. So the participants are choosing what they are interacting with and reading in these spaces. Obviously, they find them interesting. Usually one of the reasons that people kind of look down on these communities is because they're not about canonical or literary texts, but they're interesting texts, which causes motivation. And then the social interaction, besides just being a new way of text reading and creation, and also a way to help people learn from each other, it's also motivating, having that social interaction surrounding the text and the writing. And then the other direction, so the way to kind of gauge engagement in these communities is we can look at time, which is something Guthrie and lots of other people look at, as far as time spent in an activity, showing motivation, but then also response. So that's where we get Rosenblatt, and then also Wilhelm and Smith, who study reading engagement. So the way that people respond in these online communities can show that engagement. And to explain that a little further, the responses are engaged. They're social, they're interactive, and remixed. They're basically new literacies. So to bring that all together, looking at their literacy practices by discerning which engaged responses, social interactions, and new literacy participatory interactions, which they engage in the space. So all of those three things are not only reasons to look at this online community, but they're also going to kind of use to measure the engagement and the literacy practices within that community. One thing I didn't mention, because it's not really within a theoretical framework, is I'm going to also be looking at what they're doing and comparing it to Common Core standards for reading literature and seeing which of those standards, if any, or if all, which is what I suspect, they will be meeting within their online interaction. So that's it.